My name is Emma, and this is the story of how I lost everything, and then found something far more powerful. It all began the day after my husband Luke died. I stood on our front porch, numb from grief, with my overnight bag in one hand and a bouquet of wilted flowers from the hospital in the other. My eyes were puffy from crying, my hair a mess from sleeping in the hospital chair for 2 nights straight. Luke had fought for hours in the emergency room after a sudden heart attack. He was only 36. I reached into my bag for the house key. My fingers trembled as I slipped it into the lock, but it didn't turn. I frowned, tried again. Nothing. I took a deep breath, wiped my hand on my jeans, and tried the spare key. Still nothing. My heart started to pound, and not from grief this time. I knew this lock. I'd used it every day for 4 years, and now it was like I didn't live here anymore. That's when I noticed something strange. Through the living room window, I saw boxes. Cardboard boxes, a suitcase, a set of pink velvet cushions that weren't mine. I pressed my face to the glass to get a better look. And then I saw them. Karen, Luke's mother, was inside. So was Luke's sister, Stephanie. They were unpacking boxes like they were moving in, laughing, drinking tea from my favorite mugs. My head spun. I knocked. No answer. I knocked louder. Finally, the door opened, and there stood Karen, arms folded across her chest, lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Emma," she said, tilting her head. "Didn't expect you so soon." "What's going on?" I asked, stepping forward. "Why can't I open the door? Why are you here?" Karen didn't move. Instead, she leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, like this was all some minor inconvenience. "Because you don't live here anymore," she said plainly. "My son paid for this house, and now that he's gone, it belongs to his real family. You can leave." I blinked at her. I was sure I'd misheard. I'm his wife," I stammered. "We bought this house together. What are you talking about?" Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. You married him with no prenup, no job, no children. You contributed nothing. Luke paid the mortgage. Everything here is his. And now that he's gone, it reverts to us. You don't belong here anymore." Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. My blood ran cold. Stephanie appeared behind her, holding a stack of plates from our kitchen. "You left the door unlocked at the hospital," she said with a smirk. "So we just moved in. We thought you wouldn't mind." Something in me broke. I burst out laughing. The kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. Karen narrowed her eyes. "What's so funny?" I steadied myself, wiped a tear. I couldn't even tell anymore if it was from laughter or grief, and said, "You're unpacking your little knickknacks in a house you think belongs to you. But here's the thing, Karen." I leaned in, voice low and steady. "The house was mine." Karen's smirk faltered. 2 years ago, when Luke's credit was wrecked from those failed investments you pushed him into," I continued, "I refinanced the house in my name. Every mortgage payment since then came from my account. Luke was recovering. I took on a full-time job and held this place together." Karen's jaw clenched. She turned, clearly trying to think of a response. I kept going. "I didn't want to throw this in your face during the funeral. I didn't want to be that person. But now, you changed my locks. You broke into my home, and you're unpacking like you own the place." Stephanie put down the plates, her face turning red. "That's not true. He said he told us—" "What he told you doesn't matter," I snapped, "because legally this house is in my name. And the fact that you're here without permission, that makes you a trespasser." Karen's face was pale now. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and began dialing. "Should we see what the police think?" Karen snatched her handbag, calling for Stephanie. "We're not finished, Emma," she hissed. "This house should have stayed in the family. Luke was too soft on you." I stepped back, watching them storm out like children who'd been caught stealing candy. And there I stood, on the porch of my own home, key still useless in the lock. Heart shattered, but strangely empowered. They thought I was weak, that I had no fight left in me. But they had no idea who I had become while they were busy pretending I didn't matter. This was just the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Even with the locks changed and the house finally silent again, my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's face. Smug, cold, triumphant. Her words echoed like static. You don't live here anymore. The audacity of it. The cruelty. Luke had only been gone one day, and his family had already tried to erase me. Not just from the house, from his life, our life. I woke up before sunrise, made myself a coffee I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair where Luke used to sit. He always added cinnamon to his cup. I never liked it, but I still bought it just for him. The jar sat on the counter, untouched. As the first light crept into the room, I made a decision. I wasn't going to cry today. I wasn't going to let Karen take one more thing from me. That morning, I called the funeral home. "Hi, this is Emma Walker," I said. "I need to make some changes to the guest list for Luke's memorial service." There was a pause. "Certainly, ma'am. What changes would you like to make?" I exhaled slowly. His mother and sister are no longer welcome. I hung up before I could second-guess myself. Later that day, I went into Luke's office, a small room at the back of the house with messy stacks of receipts, books, and unopened mail. I hadn't been in here since the hospital. Everything smelled like him. Faint cologne, printer ink, and that weird citrus candle he insisted helped him focus. I needed to find paperwork. Anything that could help me understand why Karen thought she had a claim on this house. She had spoken so confidently, like she knew something I didn't. And then I saw it. A small file folder on the desk, labeled in Luke's handwriting. Prenup? Do not discard. I stared at it, confused. Luke and I never signed a prenup. At least I didn't think we had. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were several pages, printed on official letterhead, dated just a week before our wedding 3 years ago. My name. Luke's name. Legal terms I didn't fully understand. And one line, highlighted in yellow. In the event of my death, all jointly owned assets, including property, shall be transferred fully to my spouse, Emma Walker, unless otherwise stated in a last will and testament. I blinked. This wasn't a prenup. It was a postnup, a financial agreement Luke must have drafted after our marriage. Something he never told me about. And tucked behind it was a handwritten note. In case Karen ever tries anything. You know how she is. Keep this. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and laughed. Softly, bitterly. Of course he knew. Of course he'd prepared. Luke had been the peacekeeper between us, always telling me to give her grace, that she meant well, that she's just scared of losing control. But deep down, even he knew she'd try something like this. I stood up and walked back to the front door. For the first time since he died, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Power. The next afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised to see Karen standing there, dressed in black, sunglasses on even though it was cloudy. Beside her was a man in a gray suit holding a clipboard. "Emma," she said flatly, "this is Mr. Langley, my family attorney. We're here to discuss next steps for the house." I didn't open the door. "Next steps?" I asked, my voice calm. Karen nodded as if this were a meeting between polite acquaintances. Luke left no will, which means his estate is up for legal division. As his next of kin, we have a right to claim what belongs to him, and to us. I tilted my head. "You mean me? His wife? His legal spouse?" Karen's mouth twitched. I took a slow breath. "Actually, I'm so glad you came. Saves me a trip." I stepped away from the door and came back holding the postnup in one hand and the deed in the other. Do you want to read the part where it says I inherit everything? I asked, voice still calm. Or should I call my lawyer and let her explain it to you in court? Karen's attorney reached out for the documents, but I pulled them back. You can have your copy when you get one through official channels, I said, then locked the screen door. And until then, stay off my porch. Karen's face cracked, just slightly, but it was enough. She knew. She lost. They turned and walked back to the car without another word. And for the first time since Luke died, I smiled. But what I didn't know was that Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The days after that confrontation with Karen were quiet. Unsettlingly so. No more unexpected visitors. No letters. No late-night calls. Part of me hoped, foolishly, that she had finally accepted the truth. That she'd crawled back to her own miserable life and let me mourn in peace. But another part of me knew better. Karen didn't back down. She regrouped. Still, I tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy. I spent most of my time sorting through Luke's things, packing up some of his clothes, organizing the paperwork in his office. Each drawer I opened felt like pulling back a layer of grief. One morning, I found his old camera bag buried in the back of our closet. Inside were dozens of memory cards. Some of them from our honeymoon, others from random road trips or lazy afternoons in the backyard. I spent the whole day looking through them, smiling through tears. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, lit one of Luke's favorite candles, and sat on the porch just as the sun dipped below the trees. For a moment, I felt something like peace. And then I saw the envelope sticking out of the mailbox. No stamp. No address. I looked around. The street was empty. I opened it carefully. To whom it may concern, we are writing to inform you that a formal petition has been filed with the County Probate Court by Karen Blake, mother of the late Luke Walker, challenging the legitimacy of the property transfer between Mr. and Mrs. Walker. The petitioner alleges that undue influence, mental distress, and coercion may have played a role in the post-nuptial agreement. A hearing has been scheduled. I dropped the letter. She was going to court. Despite the deed. Despite the signed agreement. Despite Luke's note. And the worst part? She was accusing me of manipulating him. I called my lawyer, Angela, immediately. Her voice was calm, as always. Too calm. I had a feeling she'd pull something like this, Angela said. It's all noise, Emma. If we have the deed, the contract, and proof of his mental competence at the time, we'll win. She's accusing me of coercion, I said, my voice shaking. Angela paused. I know. And I know it feels personal, because it is personal. But she's not interested in the truth. She wants control. I want to fight, I whispered. I want to destroy her. Angela's tone shifted. Good. But we do it smart. You keep quiet. You don't reach out. Let me handle the court. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time, clutching that letter like it might bite. 2 days later, I got another surprise. This one didn't come in an envelope. It came in the form of a text message from James, Luke's old business partner. Hey, I didn't want to get in the middle of anything, but Karen called me. She said you might have pressured Luke to transfer the house. I know that's not true, but she's asking for emails, medical records, anything to prove he was mentally unfit. I stared at the screen, stunned. I hadn't spoken to James in over a year. Not since Luke stepped away from the company after his heart issues started. They had parted on neutral terms, but now Karen was clearly dragging everyone into this, digging for anything she could twist. Did you tell her anything? I replied. A few dots appeared. Then, no. But, Emma, she mentioned something about Luke's last investor meeting. Said he was confused, forgetful. She's building a case. That's when the knot in my chest turned to dread. Because I knew what Karen was talking about. There was one morning, just months before Luke died, when he'd come home from a client meeting looking pale and shaken. He couldn't remember where he'd parked. He forgot the name of the client he'd just spoken to. He blamed it on stress. said he hadn't been sleeping well. But what if it had been more than that? What if Karen had found out? What if she had medical records? I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, holding my phone, heart pounding. If she could convince the court that Luke wasn't in his right mind, even if it was just circumstantial, she might be able to unravel everything. And then it hit me like a punch to the stomach. Luke had seen a neurologist. He hadn't wanted me to come with him. Said it was probably nothing. But what if that appointment held the key to everything? I rushed to his office and yanked open every drawer. Files, folders, envelopes. I tore through it all until I found it. An unopened letter from St. Michael's Neurology. I ripped it open. Dear Mr. Walker, following your recent cognitive assessment, we are pleased to inform you that your results fall within the normal range. No signs of early cognitive decline were detected. I let out a breath that nearly became a sob. He had been okay. And now, I had proof. I clutched the letter to my chest like a lifeline, because Karen had just declared war, and I was finally ready to fight back. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and quiet, like the sky itself was holding its breath. I stood in front of the courthouse in a black dress and flats, clutching my bag as if it could protect me. Inside was everything I needed. The deed, the post-nup, Luke's neurology letter, and just enough rage to keep me standing upright. Angela met me on the steps. Ready? She asked gently. I nodded. She's going to lie, isn't she? Angela gave me a tight smile. Oh, absolutely. But lies don't last long in court. We walked inside. Karen was already there, sitting in the front row with her attorney, Mr. Langley. And her face was pure theater, dressed in grief, draped in black lace, with a tissue clutched dramatically in her hand. Stephanie sat beside her, eyes cast downward like a dutiful daughter in mourning. Neither of them looked at me, but that didn't matter. I wasn't here for them. I was here for Luke, for the life we built together, and the future she was trying to rip away from me piece by piece. The hearing was brief. Angela presented the deed, the notarized post-nup, and the medical letter from Luke's neurologist. When Mr. Langley tried to argue that Luke had been under duress, Angela asked one simple question. Do you have any documentation that supports that claim? He didn't. By the end of the session, even the judge seemed irritated. I see no grounds to dispute the legality of the property transfer, he said firmly. This house legally belongs to Mrs. Emma Walker. Case dismissed. And just like that, it was over. Or so I thought. As I stepped outside, Karen followed me out. You may have won the house, she hissed, the mask of grief crumbling off her face. But you can't erase me. I'm his mother. I didn't erase you, I said without turning around. You did that to yourself. She stopped walking. What's that supposed to mean? I turned slowly. Luke's funeral is tomorrow. You're not invited. Her face twisted. You can't keep me from my own son's funeral. I held her gaze. I already did. I called the funeral home the morning after you changed my locks. Your name is off the guest list. If you show up, they'll escort you out. You vindictive little... No, I interrupted, my voice low and calm. You don't get to call me anything. Not after what you did. You tried to steal my home. You spread lies about me in court. And worst of all, you tried to take his death and turn it into a power play. She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. Luke wouldn't want you there, I added. And you know it. I turned and walked away before she could respond. But that night, I didn't sleep. Not out of guilt, but fear. Because Karen didn't lose gracefully. She didn't lose quietly. The morning of the funeral came like a tidal wave, sudden and cold. I woke early, dressed in the black dress I had worn at Luke's court hearing, and went to the guest list one more time to confirm. Karen and Stephanie were not on it. The service was scheduled for noon. By 10, people had already begun arriving at the chapel. Friends, colleagues. A few distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. They came with soft smiles and kind words, placing hands on my shoulder, telling me how much Luke had meant to them. "He always talked about you," one woman said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Always said you were the best thing that ever happened to him." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." By 11:45, every seat in the chapel was full. Except for the two in the very back. I noticed them immediately. Karen and Stephanie. They had come anyway. They weren't on the guest list. They weren't supposed to be allowed through the doors. But there they were, dressed like mourning royalty, expressions locked in fake composure. I stood frozen at the front of the chapel, my heart thudding in my chest. Angela, who had come as a friend, touched my arm. "Do you want me to handle it?" I shook my head. "Number, I'll do it." I walked down the aisle as the room quieted and all eyes followed me. Karen looked up as I approached, her jaw tight. "You're not supposed to be here," I whispered. Karen folded her arms. "I'm not leaving." "Then I will." Her eyes flickered in surprise. "I'll walk out right now and I'll take the minister with me. We'll do the funeral somewhere else. A park, the backyard, I don't care. But I will not let you sit here and pretend to be a grieving mother when all you care about is what you didn't get." Karen stood up abruptly, but before she could speak, Stephanie reached for her arm. "Mom," she whispered, "let's go." Karen stared at her, stunned. Stephanie avoided her gaze and stood up, her eyes on the floor. After a long pause, Karen followed, seething in silence as they walked out of the chapel. The door clicked shut behind them, and I finally exhaled. The minister began to speak, and I said goodbye to the man I loved, surrounded by people who actually knew what love was. The day after the funeral, the house was still. Not peaceful, just eerily quiet, like the walls were waiting for something to happen. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in black, staring at the empty spot next to me where Luke used to sleep. The scent of him still lingered faintly on the pillow. It felt like he might walk in any minute with coffee in hand, humming that off-key song he always made up when he thought I wasn't listening. But he wouldn't. He was really gone. And in the absence of his presence, all that remained was his legacy, and the mess his mother had tried to create in the shadows. The court had ruled in my favor. Karen had been kicked out of the funeral. Stephanie hadn't even looked me in the eye. But I knew better than to assume it was over. People like Karen didn't just leave. They waited. And then they circled back. So when I saw her car parked across the street that morning, engine off, windows cracked just enough to smoke a cigarette, I wasn't surprised. I simply stepped onto the porch with my coffee in hand and stared her down until she flicked her cigarette out the window and drove away. She never had the courage to face me directly again. Over the next few weeks, I focused on cleaning out Luke's office, room by room, item by item. Each drawer I opened brought a new wave of memories. His watch, a box of old business cards, a photo of the two of us at the lake before everything got complicated. But it wasn't just grief I felt anymore. It was determination. Karen had tried to strip me of everything, my home, my reputation, even my right to mourn the man I loved. She thought I'd fall apart. She thought I'd crawl away and disappear. Instead, I did something else. I started digging. In the backyard, where Luke had always dreamed of building a garden. He talked about it often, usually while flipping through seed catalogs or pointing at YouTube videos about compost. It had been his dream, and I had ignored it. Always too busy, always saying, maybe next season. But now the garden was going to grow, and it was going to grow in his name. Every morning before work, I pulled weeds, turned soil, and planted rows of vegetables and wildflowers. I worked in silence, letting the earth calm me. I watched as the first signs of life began to peek through. Green shoots, buds, the promise of something beautiful. It became my sanctuary, my therapy. And one day, while I was watering the flower bed, I saw an envelope tucked under the welcome mat by the door. No return address. I picked it up, already knowing who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just 6 typed words in large, bold font. This house will always be mine. I read it once, then laughed. Not bitterly, but lightly, almost with relief. Karen had nothing left. No legal ground, no power, just words. She couldn't come near me. The restraining order Angela helped me file had seen to that, but she still needed to make herself known, like a ghost tapping on glass, hoping to remind me she still existed. But I wasn't scared of ghosts anymore. I walked calmly into the house, took the letter, and used it as mulch in the garden bed. Pressed it deep into the soil where the marigolds were just beginning to bloom. Luke would have appreciated the symbolism. Months passed. The house slowly stopped feeling haunted. The walls breathed again. The hallway no longer echoed with grief, but with the quiet hum of healing. I painted the guest room. I changed the curtains. I planted herbs in the kitchen window like I always said I would. I was no longer surviving. I was reclaiming. One evening in early spring, I stood in the garden, the sky glowing pink above me, and realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for her. Not for pain. I was living again with Luke always in my thoughts, and that was the greatest revenge of all.